In today's review, I'll be taking a look at Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge, an original Game Boy game released back in 1991 by Konami. This game is a direct sequel to the first Castlevania game that was released on Game Boy, but I didn't play that one, and I don't think anybody really needs to play that one if they want to play this game. The story of Belmont's Revenge is told in a surprisingly lengthy few paragraphs that you find in the manual, if you should happen to have picked one up for this game. But even if you didn't, you can also get the same story details just by starting the game in some scrolling text. So that's nice. The only context this game's story uses from the previous game is that Christopher Belmont defeated Dracula 15 years ago, but Dracula wasn't totally defeated. He still exists in some non-corporeal form. And the story of this game begins with a ceremony where Christopher's son Soleil is being honored as the next vampire hunter, taking his father's role. And the day after this ceremony in honor of Soleil, he vanishes. Turns out it was Dracula, kidnapping again. And so Christopher has to go rescue his son and save Transylvania from Dracula again. Big surprise. Anybody who knows anything about the Castlevania series knows that story is an afterthought. So let's get into the most important thing, the gameplay. This game came out before Symphony of the Night, so of course it follows the more traditional, older style of Castlevania gameplay. Instead of one large, interconnected map that you spend the whole game exploring, you'll find smaller, linear level designs. And instead of RPG elements that allow your character to grow and progress and get many new abilities as you play through the game, you can expect a much smaller array of tools at your disposal as you make your way through this game. While the levels in this game are fairly linear, one thing that isn't linear is that you get to choose the order in which you play them. After Soleil was kidnapped, 4 castles get erected around the countryside, and you get to choose the order in which you attempt to conquer these castles. There's a cloud castle, a plant castle, a rock castle, and a crystal castle. And each one of these has its own boss at the end of it for you to fight, and each one of them is a fairly large, semi-backtrackable, semi-interconnected environment. And what I mean by that is that you'll find a few screens in each castle that you can go back to and a few that you can't. I found that sometimes I would be able to go back to screens that I had traveled to vertically but not horizontally, for whatever reason. Each castle you explore tends to have its own visual aesthetics and recurrent enemies and environmental hazards that you see throughout it. And once you defeat the bosses in all 4 of these castles, you'll then unlock Dracula's castle, which is no spoiler, it's not a surprise. And that's when the difficulty starts to rise a little bit. To save your progress on this journey, you're given a password system, which is a more antiquated way of doing things than the way games save nowadays. Because it's a password system, it isn't perfect. So the details about your playthrough are not going to be saved exactly. Character power-ups and the exact place you were in the castle that you were last working on aren't going to be preserved perfectly. The game will get pretty close to the area you last were, but it won't be exact. If I had to place this game in a genre, I would call it a side-scrolling action platformer. And a pretty damn good one at that. Like in most older Castlevania games, Christopher moves pretty slowly and doesn't jump very far. He also has a pretty limited array of weapons and tools at his disposal for fighting all the enemies that you come across in the game. However, the game's mechanics are precise and predictable, and that allows the player to hone their skills despite how limited the player character's abilities are to overcome all the challenges in this game. Christopher Belmont moves really slowly and is not a good jumper. So you have to make up for that as a player by having really fast reflexes and precise movements. If you're precise enough in your timing and positioning in this game, you can defeat some enemies that otherwise will seem impossible. I surprised myself just by attempting certain bosses over and over again until I started to pick up on subtleties of positioning and timing that honestly don't factor into very many games at all, nowadays or otherwise. Playing an older Castlevania game like this is a very pure video game experience that will test your reflexes in the best of ways. It's a whole lot of fun. There's no map or menu screens of any sort to worry about in this game. It's very simple. You just have your whip and sometimes a sub-weapon. And there are only 2 sub-weapons in this game, the axe and holy water, which are 2 of the better sub-weapons in Castlevania games, in my opinion. They're both pretty fun to use and useful on a number of occasions, but you won't find yourself equipped with these sub-weapons very often because they're kind of rare. They don't appear as items that you find very often. And also, when you die, they will be taken away. There's no way to save your character in any state where you have these sub-weapons. They're just gone as soon as you die once. So they're very precious and not to be taken for granted. Christopher also has a whip, the classic Castlevania weapon, which appears often, and the whip has 3 power levels that you can upgrade it to, and just like sub-weapons, if you upgrade it to a higher level of power, you'll lose that upon dying. And the whip upgrades just by finding these little crystal balls. You can upgrade it 2 times, so it has 3 power levels, and the first time it'll just make it stronger and maybe increase the range a little, and the second power-up will give you a projectile. The whip will actually send fireballs at your foes from a distance, so that's pretty cool. Christopher can crouch, and also climb up and down ropes. And importantly, he can whip from either of those positions, and you will find yourself needing to do that in a number of situations in this game. One of the older game design features in this game is a level timer, which constantly runs down as you make your way through any of the castles in the game. While I've always been annoyed by timers in games, I will say that at least they give you a lot of time in this game, such that you probably won't ever find yourself running out of time. I actually had to leave the game running for about 10 minutes just to see what would happen if I ran the timer down once, and what happens is an alarm starts beeping at you when you have about 50 seconds left, and then you just die when it gets to 0. These games do demand careful, precise movements from the player, and I think a timer doesn't facilitate that kind of gameplay very well. But on the other hand, the journey to go rescue your son from Dracula does sound kind of urgent, so it makes sense in a way that you're timed. I really do like the platforming in this game a lot, and I think the game designers were very creative in their use of both environmental hazards and enemies in the platforming. There's a good diversity of hazards you'll come across, things like spiked pits and other spiky things. Lots of bottomless pits. The game even has a few occasions where you'll have to use specific enemies to get to a place that you can't otherwise access, like a spot where there are spiders descending down, rappelling on strands of silk that you then have to climb on to cross a pit that has no other way of crossing it otherwise. Visually speaking, I think this game looks pretty great for a Game Boy game. The environments are quite detailed and display a decent number of different textures. You can notice that kind of as you go through the different castles. And enemies have some pretty cool sprites here and there too, for a little Game Boy game. The best sprites are of course found in the boss fights, and 1 or 2 are more impressive than others. But overall, I think this game looks great. Also, the size of Christopher on the screen as it scrolls is good. There's a good balance between player character and environment size. The scaling is right. The game designers do their best to immerse you in the gothic world of a Castlevania game, despite the Game Boy's limitations. So you'll see plenty of intricate castle architecture and a few artistic pieces like some sculptures and even some windows showing mountains in the distance. I also think the audio of this game is rather strong for a Game Boy game. There were a surprising number of original Game Boy games that had pretty impressive soundtracks, and this game is no exception. While the Game Boy's sound fonts are pretty primitive and leave some things to be desired relative to today's technology, these tunes are hummable, and they do a great job of utilizing the full sonic range of the Game Boy. Each song has a distinct bass line as well as melodies over the top of the bass lines. And there's a lot of layering to these tracks for just Game Boy music, and it's rather impressive. And that's all I have to say about Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge. This is a simple game without very many moving parts, but what it lacks in complexity, it makes up for in the fact that nothing is wasted. There's no action or tool at Christopher's disposal that you won't need in this game. There's no activity that you'll find yourself doing in the gameplay that doesn't serve the purpose of moving through the game. There's no fat, there's no fluff. This is a pure gameplay experience, and the only things you need to enjoy it are some reflexes and some patience. Because you might die a lot. I died a lot. It took me about, I would guess, 5 hours to beat this game if I had to put a number on it. There's not a lot of content here, it won't take you that long. But the content that it does have is lean and fun. So give Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge a try, if you like pure gameplay experiences and also appreciate a bit of gothic horror. Being a fan of Dracula or vampires doesn't hurt.